Hello everyone. For tonight, I invite you to a moment in nature. We're going to take a walk in a forest and discover a lot of things about trees. How they work, how they grow, their evolutionary history, and their complexity too. Because they are not just living machines, growing by absorbing nutrients, water, carbon. They also interact with their environment. They heal. They harbor entire worlds, not just above our heads, under our feet too. And we will discover remarkable plants from around the world, some that are the tallest organisms on our planet, others that are older than the pyramids of Egypt. I hope this moment in nature will relax you and help you fall asleep. The sounds of the forest have now faded away, so that you don't get distracted as I tell you the story. But at the end of our walk, we will settle in a clearing, and you will be able to enjoy these soft sounds as you fall asleep. As always, you may shut your eyes at any time during our exploration, as the visuals are not necessary to follow along. You will just need the sound of my voice to guide you along this adventure. If this is more convenient for you, you can now also listen to my stories on music streaming platforms like Apple Music, Spotify or Amazon. There are links in the description of this video. And if you wish to download this video in HD or the audio alone and support this channel, this is possible on my Patreon page. But for now, all you need to do is adopt a comfortable position. There is probably too much tension in your shoulders right now. Try to become aware of this and gently release it. Breathe normally and take your time. Now do the same with your arms, your hands, your legs down to your feet. Take a single deep breath. We are now ready to begin our exploration journey. Trees are such a familiar thing, including for those of us who live in cities, that we barely pay attention to them most of the time. It is estimated that there are 3 trillion trees in the world. That is to say, 400 trees per human being. Some small, some over 300 feet high. Since the origin of humanity, forests have been a major source of food, building materials, and wood to burn for most communities. They could be seen as magical, sacred, haunted places sometimes. And trees were worshipped in many ancient civilizations. Maybe because trees have their roots in the ground and their branches extend towards the sky, so they can embody, represent some sort of connection between a mysterious underworld, the surface, and the heavens. For example, in Norse mythology, the various worlds were connected by Yggdrasil, an immense cosmic tree. Depending on the sources, there were 9 worlds, ours being one of them, and these 9 worlds were either piled up, one above the other, around the tree, or grouped around it, with a rainbow bridge, the Bifrost, that connected the tree with these different worlds. This concept of the world tree exists in ancient Indo-European religions, in Siberia, in Native American religions too. Another motif that appears in a lot of popular stories and beliefs around the world is the idea that there can be an intimate connection between a tree and a human being. Sometimes a man's life depends upon the tree and suffers when it withers, as if there was some sort of sympathy between the two. Or a newborn child is associated with a newly planted tree, with which its life is supposed to be bound up. There is a people in West Africa, in the Congo, the Ubangis, that keep this tradition alive, but it was more widespread around the world in the past. Trees were also worshipped or attributed powers to fulfill wishes, for example. The Celts venerated them, and their druids performed rituals in the woods. To the ancient Greeks, there were shy creatures, or spirits, the dryads, who were believed to live in trees. There are many more examples of that. Maybe a bit of these beliefs keep existing with wish trees on which people hang ribbons, or they offer coins or other offerings in the hope that their wish will come true. But what is a tree, actually? How to define it? We all understand what a tree is, but the term is everyday language. It doesn't define a particular type of plant, but rather a shape. Plenty of plants which are not directly related have developed characteristics that make us call them trees. First, there are perennials, which means that they live for a relatively long time, several years. Second, they have a trunk, an elongated stem that grows upwards and supports branches and leaves. But the trunks are not all the same thing. For example, palm trees have very little in common with an oak or a birch. Palm trees grow a trunk because their leaves grow on top of each other. So year after year, the palm tree becomes taller, but its trunk will never grow wider and doesn't form tree rings inside. There are other plants that are sometimes called trees, but they do not have a woody trunk on which the secondary growth of branches and a widening year after year can happen, tree ferns, bananas, or bamboos. I guess many of us grow with the idea that trees are fairly basic organisms. They gather water and minerals from the soil, carbon from the air, and they build themselves with these building materials. This is true, but there is so much more to trees. We are going to look further underground behind their bark and realize that they are full of surprises. They have an internal biological clock, they have sensors, they somehow exchange information, they modify the composition of the air around them. They have a still rather mysterious mechanism that makes them grow straight, independently from light or the magnetic field of the earth or gravity. They sometimes can form colonies and help other trees around them. And more generally, we're going to explore the complex ecosystem that a forest is, with all its vegetal and animal life. We will also travel from Asia to America and discover record-breaking trees, be it for their shape, size, or age. But let's begin by talking about plants in general. Where do plants come from? Like animal life, it is believed that plants come from the seas, and they were some of the most ancient life forms to appear on the planet. The first plants, as far as we know, were algae forming mats in the oceans. These mats still exist. They are composed of blue-green bacteria that live through photosynthesis, that is to say, the conversion of light energy into chemical energy. In the process, they break molecules of carbon dioxide. They keep the carbon to build themselves, and they release oxygen. This mechanism is the basis of most plants' life on Earth. There are ancient fossil rock formations called somatoliths, which are the remains of these first marine organisms. They date back 1.2 billion years ago, long before any terrestrial life existed. These first plants, algae, played a huge role in the transformation of Earth because they oxygenated the atmosphere over hundreds of millions of years. They changed the climate and the composition of the air, as well as the water in the oceans. This paved the way for other forms of life to appear in the seas. It is unclear how the first land plants began. For a long time, it was believed that marine plants diversified and grew in size until they started to adapt to land life and colonize the continents. But over the past decades, another theory has emerged, that it would be microscopic algae that colonized the land, living underground, maybe long before the appearance of land plants was estimated, and it would be these terrestrial algae that would have evolved into larger terrestrial plants. In any case, we have evidence of the first land plants around 450 million years ago, in a period called the Ordovician, when animal life was still absent on land, or limited to very small organisms living underground in a wet environment. Tens of millions of years passed again, until these primitive land plants diversified into a variety of new species, and they began to adopt the features that we associate with land plants: roots, leaves, secondary wood, that is to say, branches that grow from a stem, and a stem, a trunk, that is able to grow over time. 400 million years ago, in a period now called the Devonian, most of these features had appeared, and a bit later here still means a few million years, the first seeds appeared. At this point, about 360 million years ago, large vertical plants forming wood tissue were now present and colonizing Earth. The first forests were born. Over millions of years, they covered the land where enough water and a warm enough temperature allowed, turning the continents green and giving birth to new ecosystems where terrestrial life flourished. At the time, some of the most successful plant forms were mosses and ferns that are still familiar to us and present in most of our forests. Mosses tend to form clumps or mats, and they grow directly on the ground or on trunks. They are relatively simple plant forms. There is a single stem with tiny leaves directly attached to it, but there is close to no circulation of water and nutrients inside the plant. Mosses are sometimes mixed up with lichen, which also thrives on trunks or rocks, but is a completely different kind of organism. Lichens are composite. They arise from a mutualistic relationship between filaments of fungi and algae or bacteria. Lichens have been defined as fungi that practice agriculture. There is a symbiotic relationship in which the algae and bacteria provide energy to the fungi. Through photosynthesis, they create carbohydrates, sugars, on which the fungi feed. And the algae benefits from the moisture and nutrients from the environment that the filaments of fungi gather and protection that they provide. This symbiotic relationship appeared quickly as life spread on the continents. And because they are not a single organism, but rather a colony, lichens can have extremely long lifespans. There are lichens that are several tens of thousands of years old. As far as we know, they hold the record for longevity among terrestrial life forms. They have colonized every continent, including Antarctica, and come in a huge variety of shapes and colors. But they are not plants, or not entirely. So I was telling you that mosses were thriving already 360 million years ago. And so were ferns. Ferns are a more elaborate kind of plant because they are vascular. That is to say, they have a tissue for conducting water and minerals throughout the plant. And they also have a vascular system that makes the product of photosynthesis, carbohydrates mainly, circulate inside. Vascularization is a major evolutionary step towards the appearance of trees and generally bigger plants that can rise above the surface. Ferns have been around for hundreds of millions of years already, and they have diversified into thousands of species. Most of the species alive today appeared 100 to 200 million years ago. And there is one, the interrupted fern, which grows in the eastern United States and Canada, which is remarkable because it has remained unchanged. It has stopped its evolution for at least 180 million years. This is what fossil records indicate. Ferns reproduce via spores. They don't have seeds or flowers. We'll see the difference a little later. So what is a spore? Generally you can see them on a fern under the leaves. There are like little stacks of powder. They are very light, and they can be taken away by the wind or animals. A spore is a tiny unit of reproduction. Most of the time they consist of a single cell. When this cell finds favorable conditions, water, temperature, something to hang to, it begins dividing itself. This is the process called mitosis, when a cell replicates itself. It has chromosomes in its nucleus. The nucleus splits in two, with the same chromosomes carrying the instructions, the code for the organism to live and grow. The multiplication continues and gives birth to a new plant. Some spores use asexual reproduction. They only need themselves to grow a new plant, whereas others have only half the chromosomes. They practice sexual reproduction. Another spore has to bring the other half of the genetic code. Sexual reproduction that combines two reproductive cells is the most common life cycle in multicellular organisms, animals, fungi, and plants too. This looks a bit paradoxical because sexual reproduction is more complicated. Asexual reproduction should theoretically outperform. Every new organism alone can bear its own young, and an asexual population has an intrinsic capacity to grow more rapidly with each generation. But sexual reproduction has its advantages. It favors diversity of genes. It impedes the accumulation of genetic mutations that could make species disappear. And it is also a powerful evolutionary force, because within a population of the same species, Some individuals will be able to out-reproduce others because they are better at spreading their genes, better at securing mates when it comes to animals, or spreading their reproductive cells when it comes to plants. And this selection process boosts natural selection. From one generation to the next, it is almost imperceptible, but over time, over tens or hundreds of generations, species can get better adapted to their environment. They can avoid the risk of extinction, and they can thrive. We think this is why sexual reproduction dominates when it comes to more complex organisms. But in nature, it coexists, in fact, with asexual reproduction. The first kinds of trees were probably tree ferns that grew a trunk elevating the fronds above ground level. One of the most ancient tree-like plants from around 370 million years ago is called Archaea Terrace. It had fern-like leaves and it reproduced with spores. It could reach a reasonable size, a trunk of 1.5 meter in diameter, that's 5 feet, and a height of 80 feet. There were various species that probably formed a significant part of the canopy in early forests. The canopy is the name of the uppermost branches of the trees in a forest that form like a continuous layer of foliage. But at this point, the vegetation on Earth and forests looked very different from now, and many features of plants or types of plants were nowhere to be found yet. This was a world without seeds, without flowers, or even without grass. The first seed plants, we believe, appeared around 320 million years ago. A seed is the embryo of a plant, enclosed in an outer covering for protection. It already contains a fertilized egg, which has begun to grow within the mother plant and can be detached from it to grow a new plant somewhere else. Seeds do not have the relative simplicity of spores, and they cannot survive as long. Spores are extremely resilient. Some of them can last for thousands of years before germination. But seeds are the product of sexual reproduction, with the advantages that come with it. Their outer layer provides a degree of protection too, and keeps enclosed all they need to begin a new life cycle of the plant. So, seed plants have come to dominate biological niches on land, from forests to grasslands. With seeds appeared fruits. The fruit is not the seed itself. It is the seed-bearing structure in flowering plants. Because with the development of sexual reproduction among plants, another wonder appeared several tens of millions of years later: flowers. As far as we know, the first flowers appeared around 140 million years ago. Flowers are a powerful evolutionary innovation because their presence allows a plant to access new means, new mechanisms for reproduction, mainly with the unaware collaboration of insects. When we think about flowers, their shapes, their beauty, their colors are generally what comes to mind. And these attractive features are not accidental. Many flowers have evolved to be attractive to animals, so as to cause them to be vectors for the transport of pollen. Flowers are modified leaves. At their center, there is an ovary and female reproductive cells, eggs, and easily accessible too, there is pollen, which is a powdery substance that contains male reproductive cells. A plant may self-pollinate when its own male and female reproductive cells combine. But the main advantage of flowers is that animals may transport pollen from a flower to the next, hopefully from another plant of the same species. And doing so, they contribute to the dispersion and mixing of genes. Flowering plants have become the most diverse group of land plants. They have 300,000 known species. But they were not the only and not the first branch of seed plants, because there are two branches of seed plants, and both have trees we are familiar with. The most common are flowering plants, also called angiosperms. Angiosperm means a plant that produces seeds within an enclosure. In other words, a fruiting plant. Once the flower has served its purpose by allowing fertilization of the egg, it withers, and a fruit grows around the seed, or the seeds. But there is a second, more ancient family, the Gymnosperms. These ones do not produce flowers nor fruits. Their seeds develop on the surface of scales or leaves. So, flowering plants, angiosperms, have their eggs inside an ovary in the flower. Gymnosperms have their eggs exposed on leaves. These leaves are often modified to form cones. The most common gymnosperms are conifers, like pine trees, and we all know what pine cones look like. They are vessels for their seeds. Now, all flowers are not spectacular. For example, birch trees, which are abundant in the North Hemisphere, are angiosperms, flowering trees, even though their seeds look a lot like conifer seeds. They are certainly familiar to you if you live in Europe or the north of the United States or in Canada. In boreal forests, that is to say, forests from the north of the North Hemisphere, birch trees coexist with pine trees. They grow alongside. Boreal forests cover the north of Russia. They're also known as taiga. They cover much of Scandinavia too. There is a bit in some of the Scottish Highlands and much of Canada. Birches have distinctive trunks with thin papery plates that are often white or silver, but they can also be grey, yellow, or even black. They are a so-called pioneer species because they are not very demanding. They stand the cold, and they will grow on relatively poor soils, like many conifers do. Now there is another characteristic that distinguishes them from the pine trees that may grow nearby in these regions. A birch loses its leaves every year, whereas pine trees are evergreen. The plants that shed their leaves, it can be trees, shrubs, even herbs, are called deciduous. Now shedding all the leaves every year, it looks like a waste of energy and resources. So why have so many trees developed this particularity? Because there are many: maple, many oaks, aspen, beech, elm. It has advantages compared to plants with evergreen foliage. Of course, they need resources to regrow new foliage during the next season. But these leaves fall around the trees, and they eventually return to the soil. So resources in minerals are not lost forever. But getting rid of their foliage allows them to avoid water loss during the winter, when the air is drier. It stops evaporation from the leaves. They also avoid predation from herbivores. In cold regions they will be spared branch and trunk breakage because of the snow. In some cases, repairing leaves and keeping them functional may be more costly than just losing them and regrowing them later. All in all, both models have their advantages and disadvantages, and they coexist in nature. What is fascinating and telling about plants is how these various species of trees detect the changes in their environment and how they trigger the loss of the leaves or the regrowing. This indicates that trees, plants in general, are not just living machines. They have an internal biological clock or sensors able to measure the temperature or the light. The triggers to the shedding of the leaves depend on the species. Sometimes it can be temperature. When trees detect a lasting fall in temperature, they go into winter mode and they stop maintaining their leaves. They will wither and fall. This generally happens in autumn, and the drop of their leaves, their change in colors, create these wonderful forest landscapes in this season. Or it can be the hours of lighting during the day that tell the trees when to shed their foliage. In tropical forests, it is the change in the rainfall pattern. During the dry period, the foliage is dropped to conserve water, and in this case, leaf drop is not dependent on seasons. It can happen any time during the year, when the climate stays dry or wet for an extended period of time. Trees no longer have their leaves to synthesize carbohydrates. They stop growing and they go asleep for a few months. But inside their roots, their trunk and their branches, they keep everything they need, the resources in food and water, to restart a new cycle. All these characteristics developed along the tens of millions of years of plant evolution. And by the time of the dinosaurs, in the Cretaceous and the Jurassic periods, forests were now closer in the way they worked as ecosystems to how we know them today. And yet, a major family of plants was still missing. There was no grass. Many plants that have become abandoned around us, from cereal grasses to bamboo to the cultivated lawns, they had not appeared yet. They are all part of the family of grasses, also called gramineae. This family of flowering plants that are the basis of a large part of our agriculture. It appeared as the dinosaurs were nearing extinction around 66 million years ago. But it could have been earlier. The dating of their origins is still imprecise. In any case, they appeared long after the first trees. In some forms, like bamboo, they could create forests or join them. But they were very good at colonizing open spaces, grasslands, like savanna or prairie or wetland. All sorts of plants are important to mankind, indirectly through their impact on the climate and the atmosphere and the preservation of soils, or directly as a source of food. But probably no family is as important as the grasses, because they are the basis of agriculture. Corn, rice, wheat, and so on. It's all grasses. They are the basis for herding, even building materials like bamboo and straw. Humanity as we know it couldn't exist without grasses. In the 60 million years that separate us from their emergence, all families of plants have kept evolving and adapting to their environment. But as far as we know, the type of biotopes that we call forests were now formed and functioned as they keep functioning today, in their variety of plant families, from the most basic algae in the soils and lichen to mosses, ferns, seed plants, some of them with flowers and fruits, and grasses. The biggest factor that has affected forests since then is mankind. I told you at the beginning that there are about 400 trees per human being in the world. This is a lot, and yet this number has decreased. Before the advent of agriculture, it is estimated that Earth had twice as many trees as it does now. Human activity has reduced forested areas, and to a degree this continues. Overall, forested areas are stable or slightly growing in North America, Europe and Russia. But this doesn't compensate for deforestation in the tropics and in the South Hemisphere, in Brazil, Africa and Southeast Asia. But still, forests cover almost a third of the land, and for the most part, their biomass is trees, the largest plant form. So let's take a look at how a tree works beyond the bark, because it is an amazing organism. It pumps water from the soil and sends it, sometimes tens of meters upwards, with no muscle. It creates the material it is made of from the air. It interacts with its environment. A big part of the material it is made of is wood. But what is wood exactly? It is a composite of mainly two elements. There is a matrix of lignin and fibers of cellulose. Both are complex materials. Lignin, that gives it its rigidity, is an organic polymer, a big complex molecule made of carbon, oxygen and hydrogen. Carbon is its main component. This lignin matrix is very important because at the cellular level it gives rigidity to the cell walls and it repels water. It is hydrophobic, and this facilitates conducting water in plant stems. It is present in every vascular plant. The other component is cellulose, another compound made of the same elements, carbon, oxygen, and a bit of hydrogen, but organized differently. It tends to absorb water, contrary to lignin, and the difference in properties comes from the different organization of the molecules. The two combined, this lignin matrix and the cellulose long chains of molecules, fibers, form the vegetal tissue that we call wood. Thanks to its molecular structure, lignin gives it its rigidity. Trees, as we saw before, are capable of secondary growth. They can divide their cells and expand in size as they accumulate building materials they take from their environment. This growth is responsible for these growth rings in wood. When trees grow continuously in regions with little seasonal difference, the rings would be almost indistinct or even absent. But when seasons are marked, the annual growth period will result in a visible ring between the existing wood and the bark, the outer envelope. The tree grows a new layer of young wood. So, typically in a tree, the oldest parts are the center of the trunk and the bark. But sometimes the bark will fall and let a more recent layer appear. On young trees, the bark may be smooth, but as the tree ages, the bark becomes rougher due to its exposure to the outside world and due to the tension from the inside as new layers grow, making all these wrinkles appear at the surface of the tree. As the tree ages, the first older rings of wood will become more resistant to decay. They form heartwood. It remains useful as a structural element that keeps the tree standing, but it no longer is vital to the tree. Heartwood may actually disappear from a tree It is infrequent, but there are shallow trees which have lost the heart of their trunk and they keep living. The younger, outermost wood, the one that has grown more recently between the heart and the bark, is living wood, or green wood as it is sometimes called. It is called sapwood, and it is the part of the trunk that conducts water from the roots to the leaves, and also that stores up and gives back the reserves prepared in the leaves, depending on the season. So what is this active vascular system made of inside a tree? There are two types of transport tissues in vascular plants, and they are separate. Trees need to pump water and nutrients from the soil and distribute this water to their foliage. So there is a first upward movement, and then the leaves responsible for photosynthesis produce molecules, sugars, that have to descend to the trunk and roots to be used and stocked up. The first transport tissue responsible for transporting water upwards is called xylem. Xylem carries sap, but a sap mainly consisting of water and inorganic elements coming from the soil. Now a problem is how to transport water several meters or dozens of meters above ground in a plant that has no muscles or mechanical parts to do it. It has to be a passive transport, and actually it is believed that this is what limits the maximum height of trees. There are several phenomena and several theories that explain how the water rises in the tree. The first one is a pull mechanism from the top of the tree due to the evaporation of water in the leaves. The vessels transporting the water are very small in diameter, meaning that water can easily go up by capillarity when evaporation creates a negative pressure at the top. Another mechanism is root pressure. The roots are in the soil, but they tend to have a lower water potential than the soil. What does it mean? You know that water has a tendency to move from one area to another due to osmosis when it is in close contact with a solution that has a higher concentration of elements dissolved in it. Osmosis tends to rebalance the concentration between two solutions. In this case, the osmotic differential between the roots and the soil tends to send water upwards, away from the roots, to rebalance their osmotic pressure with that of the soil. And yet another phenomenon that makes water go up in the tree is another osmotic phenomenon. The sap in the xylem has a low concentration of elements. It is primarily water. And upward in the tree is a sap much richer, a richer solution that contains the sugars produced in the leaves. This also tends to suck water upwards. These are the mechanisms that allow water to circulate in a tree that stands still and otherwise has no active way of pumping. I told you there was separate system, the one that carries photosynthesis products to parts of the plants where they are needed, generally downwards. This second system is called phloem, and it is the innermost layer of the bark. This is the one that transports a rich sap, full of the sugars produced in the leaves. So you understand that trees have two kinds of sap. There is xylem sap, the one that moves up, and is actually the primary ingredient of maple syrup. There are several kinds of maples that produce this sweet xylem sap, which is reduced to concentrate the flavor in the syrup. And there is phloem sap, which is richer in sugars. Thanks to it, trees stock up resources in their trunk and their roots. Apart from serving to anchor the tree to the ground and gather water and nutrients, roots also serve for energy storage, reproduction, defense, sometimes revival. You may have seen a new tree popping out of apparently nowhere near another one of the same species, or reviving from the base of its apparently dead trunk. This is still the same tree, taking a new start from underground because its roots were preserved. Roots are also a world in themselves. So let's take a look at them. When a new plant appears, from a seed for example, it has an embryonic root, the radicle, that goes straight downwards and develops into a taproot. After some time, lateral roots branch out and will grow horizontally. Near the tips of the finer roots are little hairs made of a single cell that are in contact with the soil particles and can absorb water and nutrient by osmosis. But how do plants know what is up, what is down? They systematically make the roots search for soil, and the stem grows straight. But how can they do that? They don't have eyes or any sensory organs to perceive their environment. It is actually still a bit of a mystery. For a long time, it was believed that light guided growth of the trees and explained why they grew straight. Another possible explanation was that they could perceive gravity or the magnetic field of the earth, and somehow this would have guided their growth. Maybe there is something of all this, but experiments in the recent past have revealed that this may be more complex. Very young trees were put to grow in a centrifuge, which constantly moved and made them lose any sense of up and down, if they had one. They were deprived of light that could guide them, and yet they grew straight, with the roots going one way and the straight stem the opposite way. We don't fully understand how it works at this point. Tree roots form complex systems underground. They are not alone. As they develop underground, they encounter filaments of fungi, and they form mutualistic relationships with them. Some fungi are specific to a single tree species. the tree acquires minerals like phosphorus from the fungi, and the fungi get food. They obtain a bit of the carbohydrates, the sugars, produced way above from photosynthesis. The fungi may grow filaments that connect the roots of various trees, forming a network through which signals and nutrients may be transferred. This association of roots and fungi began a long time ago, when the first vascular plants colonized dry land. And there is more. Sometimes the roots of different trees directly connect, their tissues merge, like in a sort of natural grafting, and the trees form a colony that is invisible from the surface. Other experiments in the past couple of decades have revealed that these colonies, interactions between trees, and the complexity of the communities they form were much higher than thought before. For example, traceable chemicals were injected into a tree, and shortly after it was found in neighboring trees that shared the same roots system. Or there are trees with a defense mechanism. They will close their leaves in response to the detection of a threat, or they release volatile compounds that can kill microbes and prevent them from rotting or being eaten by insects and animals. When one tree is exposed to such a threat and reacts, other trees nearby may also react the same way, as if the first tree had warned them. We don't know how it works exactly, if it is through the release of compounds by the tree leaves, or underground through the roots and their connections. But this strongly suggests that there is a form of communication, an exchange of information between trees. They may not be sentient or thinking organisms, but they are definitely more elaborate, complex, and awe-inspiring than previous generations thought. And sometimes trees reach sizes or masses or ages that defy our imagination. The tallest standing tree in the world at the moment is a sequoia, also known as coastal redwood, named Hyperion. It is in the Redwood National Park in California. It was measured at 380 feet, 116 meters. Its exact location in the park is kept secret to protect the tree from damage. It has the height of a 30 to 35-story building, and it is estimated to be 6 to 8 centuries old. Coastal redwoods often reach impressive heights. Trees over 200 feet are quite common. They can reach such a size first because they have a very long lifespan. They can typically live 16 to 18 centuries. There are some of these trees that were already standing at the time of the Roman Empire, and since then they have accomplished hundreds and hundreds of cycles, gaining a bit of height and a bit of width every year. Another factor that helps them is the climate. They are native to the coastal regions of California and Oregon, and these coasts are foggy. I told you earlier that an important mechanism that limits the height of trees is the difficulty to lift water from the ground up to hundreds of feet. But the fog limits evaporation at the top, so the need to bring water to the leaves is limited. Coastal redwoods are typically among the trees that form communities. Trees graft their root systems between them, and their sharing of roots keeps alive mutant individuals. They are called albino redwood. There are more than 200 of them known to exist. These trees have a mutation that prevents them from manufacturing chlorophyll. Instead of being green, their foliage is white and unproductive. But they survive as parasites. They are fed by their green neighbors, and with this system they reach adulthood and even heights of up to 66 feet, 20 meters. But maybe they are more than parasites. Research indicates that they can store higher concentrations of toxic metals, so maybe they serve as waste dumps to their neighboring trees. Redwoods are conifers. They're evergreen, and if you remember the classification we discussed earlier, they are Gymnosperms. The highest angiosperm, flowering plant, is the second largest tree in the world. It is a yellow meranti on the island of Borneo, and it was measured at 331 feet. To reach such a height, these trees have an impressive girth, but there are trees with even bigger diameters. The record of the stoutest living tree goes to a cypress from Mexico, the Arbol de Tule. It's in the south of Mexico. Its height is not that impressive, at around 35 meters, but it has a circumference of almost 140 feet. It is so large that it was initially thought to be multiple trees with their trunks stuck to one another. But DNA analysis has shown that it is only one tree. Maybe this single tree developed several trunks that ended up merging. But it is undeniably old, with estimates based on growth rates of around 1500 years. The tree was already at least 1,000 years old when the Spanish arrived in Mexico, and there is an old Zapotec legend that attributes the planting of the tree to a priest of the Aztec god of wind. The second tree with the widest trunk is a baobab in South Africa, the Sunland baobab. Baobabs can be very big trees too. There are some in Arabia and Australia, but the majority are in Africa, including the island of Madagascar. They are angiosperms. They have flowers that may hang from the tree when it blooms, and they can live thousands of years. Some specimens have been found to be more than 2,000 years. There are different species of baobabs, but many of these trees live in arid regions, so they have become experts at water preservation. They are deciduous. they shed their leaves during the dry season to limit evaporation, and they store water in their trunk. They can store up to 120,000 liters for large specimens. That's 32,000 US gallons, the equivalent to hundreds of bathtubs. With these reserves, they can survive droughts. But there are even older trees than baobabs. The oldest known single tree alive is also in California, in the mountains of eastern California. It has been dated to almost 5,000 years, meaning that it is older than the pyramids of Egypt. It is a bristlecone pine tree, and it was named Methuselah. Logically so, Methuselah was a biblical patriarch, said to have died at the age of 969. Only one other living tree is more than 3,000 years old. It is a Patagonian Cypress from Chile, called El Gran Abuelo, the great-grandfather. But these records of age are for individual trees. As we have seen before, new trees can regrow from roots, and when a colony has appeared with several trees sharing their root system, this colony, taken as a single organism, becomes theoretically eternal, or at least it can outlive any single tree. There is a root system in Sweden, Old Tjikko, which is almost 10,000 years old. It's a clonal tree. The roots have started to develop 10 million years ago, but it regrows a trunk every few centuries. Even bigger and older is Pando in Utah, United States. Pando is another clonal colony born from a single aspen. It has been determined to be a single organism by genetic tests. It has one massive root system that covers more than 100 acres. And from this root system, new stems constantly regrow. There are currently 47,000 stems, so it is basically a single organism looking like a small forest. In average, the stems and trunks are only 130 years old, but the colony is way older. It has been dated to at least 80,000 years, and some estimates even reach an age of 1,000,000 years. 1,000,000 years, and it's a plant. There would be many more things to say about nature and plants, but this is all for today. We have reached the end of our exploration journey. But our little walk in the woods is not over. The soft sounds of the forest are now going to return and lull you to sleep. I hope you enjoyed listening to this story and that you will enjoy the sounds, and I will speak to you soon about a new topic. Sleep well. Au revoir.